Hello, fellow humans. This is my interview with Timothée Parrique about degrowth policy proposals. Tim is a social scientist originally from Versailles, France. He is currently a researcher at the School of Economics and Management of Lund University in Sweden. He holds a PhD in economics from the Centre d'études et de recherche sur le développement, University of Clermont-Auvergne, France, and the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. Titled The Political Economy of Degrowth from 2019, his dissertation explores the economic implications of degrowth. Tim is the author of Ralentir ou Périr, l'économie de la décroissance, slow down or perish, the economy of degrowth, which will be published in September 2022. It is a book adaptation of his PhD dissertation. Tim is also the lead author of Decoupling, Debunked, Evidence and Arguments Against Green Growth, 2019, a report published by the European Environmental Bureau. If you like what you see and hear, please hit the subscribe button so we can win at the YouTube algorithm. First, here are some highlights.
Well-being is positional. It has, in countries that have already built the infrastructure enough to satisfy everyone's needs, then that rat race is positional. When you get first, someone gets second. So the well-being is just balanced. I would argue that right now, human nature will force us to improve our situations by reducing production and consumption so we don't die in a climate collapse. I think that's survival instinct is something you could very easily link to human nature. I need to spend a lot of time reorganizing the way we work, the way we produce, the way we move, the way we live. But the faster we do it and the bigger we do it in the global north, the more chance we give to the global south to have options. And these options, this window of opportunity is closing now. When you have some land desertifying in a global south country, when you have fisheries that collapse, when you have an ancient forest that being burned down, these things you cannot get back. Capitalism itself is a rationing system through purchasing power. So if we ration Ferraris, they're rationed. Not everyone has them. I don't know if you've noticed. I don't have one. Calling for the young generation to lay flat, to be like, we don't want to participate in the rat race anymore. Doesn't make us happy, destroy the living world. Factually, capitalism is a system where the surplus that you generate through production is being reinvested into further production. That's, what capital is. The mobilization of a resource in a new process of production that's going to create itself a surplus and being reinvested. Somehow that becomes a growth driver. If you want to degrow the economy, you want to do basically the opposite. You don't want to invest into further production. You actually want to divest and invest into, the closing down of airports, the deconstruction of parkings, the destruction of concrete in cities, all these kind of stuff. The summer of 2019, when a bunch of colleagues and I published Decoupling Debunked, that report was very arrogant on purpose. I wrote it with an arrogant bite because I was like, if a PhD student can debunk your theory of green growth, your theory of green growth must be kind of crap. And so we wrote the report, and I really made sure in the writing that there was a bite of like, okay, show me I'm wrong and I'll change my mind. The peculiarity of fossil capitalism is that it's enriching a very tiny minority at the expense of a very large majority. So we have numbers on our side. With numbers come, thinking and acting power.
We have a lot of interesting questions for you, and I've been following your work for some time since I discovered you on the Steady Stater podcast. And I read your PhD thesis, was very interesting, full of data. I'm reading your blog and I follow you on Twitter. And I see you as an encyclopedia of the degrowth movement. You are like a Denis Diderot of the degrowth movement. You are very good with lists, and I appreciate that. Your writing is very easy to follow. So in the recent article I found that focuses mostly on policy, on degrowth policy, So I would like to ask you a little bit about that. But before we go into that, can you give us your, your spiel about degrowth, the definitions? And I'll try to make it a bit different this time, because there are a lot of definitions floating around.
Okay.
So if you can think of a definition, one for a teenager living in the global north, one for an undergrad student in any random university in the global north, one for a working class person with minimal exposure to any notions of economics, and finally one for an adult from the professional capitalist class in the global north. And sound bites are welcome.
Wow. So you want 4 definitions. That's okay. Let's start with the one teenager in the global north. That's perhaps one of my favorite analogy is the one of the diet. So somehow high income countries, their biophysical metabolism, so the amount of energy and material that they use to function, is just way beyond planetary boundaries. And so that's not sustainable. And so they're basically ecologically obese. And so degrowth, even though there are just many other side motivations to do it, it's first and foremost this big diet where you're putting a rich country on a diet so that you can shrink its ecological footprint. So that would be my first definition for the teenager in the global north. Do you think that works?
I think it does. Even if we have the TikTok universe in mind, everybody knows about the word diet.
Okay. So that's good. Then undergrad.
The undergrad
right?
student. Yeah.
Undergrad. Okay. Then we're gonna switch it a notch. We're just gonna get to the next level. When we think about economic growth, we think of an economy that produces and consumes more from one year to another. So if we want to revert that process and think about degrowth, then that will be an economy that produce and consume less from one year to the other. So here we're getting into a complexity, which is not only a matter of reducing the footprint, it's a matter of acting on production and consumption in order to reduce the footprint. So let's come back to the diet. So if you want to lose 10 kilos, you can cut off one of your leg, I guess, that'll do the job. Or you can identify perhaps, some sugary and salty product that you could give up, and you could start to pick up some sports. And the result would be that you've lost the same amount of weight, but one of them is way more enjoyable than the other, I suppose. And so here we see that degrowth as a ecological strategy is to try to produce and consume less of selected ecologically intensive goods and services so that we can do that diet, shrink the ecological footprints. And then because you're an undergrad, so I'm going to go like one extra step in complexity to understand that that process of selection is not only at the level of goods and services, but also at who is producing and who is consuming. So the first important division is between rich countries and poor countries. So the concept of degrowth emerged at the beginning of the 2000s, part of the post-development scholarship, as this idea that we should have sustainable degrowth in already rich countries of the global north to liberate resources, starting with a carbon budget, for the further development of the global south. So that's the idea of, contraction in the north, convergence in the south. And the same logic of contraction and convergence also applies within a country, because we are not all producing and consuming in the same manner, and we do not all produce and consume the same things. One country might produce more of that, one industry more of that, one region, one classes of citizen consumers might consume more of that. And so we need to be selective to target goods and services whose production and consumption we can shrink so that it's ecologically effective. You end up losing your ecological footprint. but in a way that is just not impacting well-being. So in a way that's not an amputation, but rather an enjoyable diet.
Right. Can you tell us what do you mean by a carbon budget? Like for a regular person, what does that mean?
Yeah. So the IPCC, which is the international organization that's organizing research on climate change, they've calculated a number of tons of greenhouse gases that we can emit that correspond to a specific level of warming. So let's say you want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So we know from what we know about climate science that in order to have a high probability of not overshooting 1.5 degrees of warming, we should not emit more than X ton.
Right.
If you have a threshold at 2 degrees, it's a bit more tons. So we have this absolute carbon budget that we know. So if we want to mitigate climate change, it means we need to stick to that carbon budget. And of course, and I'm coming back to the issue of global justice, if you have, just like it's the case, Europe monopolizing 90% of, the available sustainable carbon budget, that leaves very little for countries and regions where needs are unmet that may need more urgently than us inhabitants of high-income countries to have access to energy to do useful things like building schools and starting new businesses and building roads and all kind of things.
Yes, makes sense. So we have two more definitions left: a working class person and an adult from the capitalist class, maybe a business owner or a CEO or something.
So when you think about a growing economy, we can imagine at least three growth drivers. One at the level of the government, so growth policies, governments trying to maximize GDP, and they enact growth policies in order to do this. You have companies that try to maximize profits, and you have consumers that try to maximize revenues. And so here, that gives us a couple of different entry points. So I'm going to start on the consumption level, on the working level, sorry, to talk to a working class person. So if I were to imagine degrowth, I like to picture this as a slowdown of the economy. That's the title of the book I've just that I've written in French, Slow Down or Perish. So we need to slow down the economy. We've seen that we've experienced during the pandemic with the lockdown. What happened during the lockdown is the economy slowed down. We produced and consumed less for a period. I'm not saying we should repeat the lockdown because that wasn't very fun, but we need to do something that has the similar effect, meaning a slowdown that will somehow reduce emissions. For example, for transport. So, we take less planes, we use less cars and all of that, and then you will see your greenhouse gas emissions decrease. And so I think when we work, we link production somehow to the hours that we spend producing. So it's also a very concrete way of imagining what degrowing an economy means. It means somehow working less, in the sense of dedicating less time to the production of these things that we're trying to reduce. So if you're an engineer designing ads for flights or planning, designing, if you're a salesperson working on trying to sell SUVs, well, that means you will have to reduce the amount of effort and time you spend every day trying to sell SUVs, because we are trying collectively to sell less SUVs. So that'll be my third definition here, focusing on work. I'm not sure it's a definition, it's rather just different entry points. The fourth one, okay, then we're going to take it the other way, because we're still at the level of production, but we're going to talk about profits, right?
Right.
So capitalism, factually, capitalism is a system where the surplus that you generate through production is being reinvested into further production. That's, what capital is. The mobilization of a resource in a new process of production that's going to create itself a surplus and being reinvested. Somehow that becomes a growth driver. If you want to degrow the economy, you want to do basically the opposite. You don't want to invest into further production. You actually want to divest and invest into, the closing down of airports, the deconstruction of parkings, the destruction of concrete in cities, all these kind of stuff. So, and you want to just somehow seize completely certain activities. So I think from this perspective, if you are an adult from the professional capitalist class in the global north, degrowth means basically a period of time where the economy is not going to generate a monetary surplus. Actually, it means the monetary surplus that we've been generating in the last few decades had a tremendous social and ecological cost. And right now, we need to retransform that accumulated surplus back into social and ecological health. So that's a bit of a disappearance of a surplus, a deaccumulation, you could call it, if we want to stick with Marxist concepts. That was my attempt. I'm not sure that is clarifying anything, but I'm sure we'll get into the concrete throughout the discussion.
Yes, I do have some follow-up questions. I will save them for later, but let's move in sequence. You published recently a paper titled Exploring Degrowth Policy Proposals, a systematic mapping with thematic synthesis. A very fancy title. Yes,
I have it right there.
So can you give us an overview of these proposals and what are your favorites?
Okay. So first, what we tried to do in this paper with Nick and Ines is to screen the degrowth literature for concrete actions. It's always that question, degrowth, okay, nice, but how?
What is it? Yes.
So we screened and made lists. As you said, I love to make lists. And I started to make such a list in my PhD thesis. So we expanded it, we continued it. And at the end, we ended up with 530 proposals. So then we decided to subdivide them into different kinds. So some of the proposals, they're aspirational, they're goals. So people in the degrowth literature, they'll say, for example, one of the goals is to reduce inequality. So there are 50 goals in that 530 proposals. So let's put those aside. Then there's a bunch of objectives. So for example, to reduce, if the goal is to a better sharing of wealth, specific objective is perhaps like to just increase the wage of some people, like just specific targeted goals. So there's 100 of them. So let's also put them aside. And that leaves us with 380 instruments. So specific instrument. And I'm not going to give you my favorite. I'm going to give you first the most popular, because we've also been looking at how many times they're being mentioned in that literature. And we did, wait for that, a top 10 of the most popular degrowth instrument in that literature that has been existing since the beginning of the 2000s.
Drum roll.
I've got them right here. So top 10. I'm going to read them and then we comment. First one, universal basic income. Then work time reduction, job guarantee with the living wage, maximum income caps, declining caps on resource use and emissions, not-for-profit cooperatives, deliberative forums, reclaiming the commons, eco-villages, and housing cooperatives. So
are these in the order of the frequency you found them in the literature?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
So universal basic income was historically the first policy associated to degrowth, because it's that magazine in 2002 where the term sustainable degrowth, décroissance soutenable, was coined. There was also an article with it, advocacy for the universal basic income as an instrument for degrowth. But now in that literature, there are many different basic incomes now. If I remember well, there was just 9 different designs.
Right.
So
maybe just a quick side note for the viewers. In Canada, there's a project in the Senate. It's in the second reading. It's for a basic income proposal. They call it a guaranteed livable income. is not as universal as I would like to have it, but it is being discussed. So it's in the Senate right now. There are chances that it might pass very soon. So feel free to expand on any of these.
Yeah. So let's take them. So we've talked a bit about work time reduction, which is both like a goal in itself, because one of the function of having an economy should be to economize labor time. So at the end of the day, a performant economy is an economy that allows you to minimize the kind of work that no one likes to do. If every year you need to work longer and longer weeks, then something is just going wrong. And so if we can collectively organize ourselves so we don't need certain goods and services, then it means we don't have to produce them. So if we ditch part of the cars, for example, by doing car sharing, so instead of each of us having one car, we share a car at the level of a building, then it means we only have to produce one car instead of 20 cars. It means we don't need advertising to sell the 30 cars. It means we don't need customer service to deal with the problem. We don't need mechanics to repair 30 cars. We actually can liberate a lot of hours throughout the economy, hours that can be reallocated into leisure and into other forms of productive activity, some of them being unpaid, some of them paid, some of them being linked to reproductive activities, other to productive activities. So work time reduction is both something that will happen anyway if you produce and consume less, an important mechanism to avoid mass unemployment during a fast degrowth transition, because it takes time to retrain people. And so if all of a sudden, well, let's say we just fly 50% less, what will happen of the people working in the aviation sector? Well, you could fire half of them, or you could just reduce their average working time by half. And they could use, they could have working time reduction with maintaining of wage, and then their free time could be used for retraining, for example, so that they can slowly transition to another industry. So that's about working time reduction. I'm going to pick one or two others.
Right. Before we move, just quickly on this one, if you don't mind, if we can flip the coin on work time reduction, some astute viewers may think that, oh, we have so much free time suddenly at our disposal, let us use it to travel more, to buy more things. How do we put this in perspective, the other side of the work time reduction proposal?
So that's the great challenge of degrowth. Every time you will see it being defined, you will always see together decrease of production and consumption. So we need the decrease of production to feed a reduction of consumption that feeds back a reduction of production. Because you're right, if we decide to just save a bit of carbon by stop to produce something, but then the people in the aviation industry, they're just going to use that time to do something else that is equally intensive, then the hours of work will just shift from one industry to the other. So what we need here is synchronizing both a culture of sufficiency at the consumption level, so new modes of leisure that are less commodity intensive, local holidays, slow traveling, spending more time with families, hanging out in nature, reading books, doing theater, discussing politics, than just, taking a flight ticket to go visit a club somewhere in Thailand, which is very ecologically intensive. So we have to rethink the way also what we do in our leisure time, so we avoid potential rebound effect, that the term in ecological macroeconomics.
And this term rebound effect, can you maybe elaborate what it means, like for regular viewers? I know it's known as the Jevons paradox, but probably most people don't know it. Just quickly, maybe.
So rebound is when you manage to reduce, for example, energy use somewhere in the economy. Let's say you discover a new car that can burn, 50% less fuel per kilometer, which is great. but you produce 4 times more cars. So you say like the savings that you had per car rebound. Actually, here it's an absolute rebound because actually total emissions will increase. So rebounds happen both at the macroeconomic level. So for example, you say like, okay, right now I really want to reduce my carbon footprint, so I'm going to stop eating beef. You stop eating beef, but since beef is very expensive, it's a huge part of food expenses, that means you're going to get some free money on your bank account. And then you're going to think, oh, nice, I've got free money. You know what? Little weekend in Thailand, boom, your energy saving through, sufficiency and stop eating beef is going to rebound through your travel to Thailand. And then we have a mechanism that is way more insidious, which is macroeconomic rebound effect. So if one sector, one company, one classes of consumers somewhere in the economy has an energy saving because of technological innovation or because of social innovation through frugality and organized sufficiency, they're going to save some energy, but someone else's, the economy is going to be, oh, nice, some available energy, and they're going to use it. And there's been a paper published a few months ago trying to estimate that rebound. And in France, it's 101%. So whatever energy you save through efficiency or sufficiency will rebound completely in less than 24 months. So that shows us something, that sufficiency, it's not possible within a capitalist system where as soon as you see an available resource, for-profit companies are going to use that as an opportunity to somehow increase their production, or consumers are going to see that as an opportunity to just consume more.
Right, makes sense. Feel free to move on to the other proposals if you want to elaborate on more.
Yeah, I'm going to comment on declining caps on resource use and emissions.
Right.
Because that's not a well-known mechanism. So I've talked about the carbon budget. And so far, the way we've been approaching carbon climate mitigation was through carbon taxes. So you put a price on carbon and you hope that, because then it becomes suddenly more expensive, companies will use less fossil fuels. The price of ecologically intense, carbon intense product is going to get higher, so consumers will buy less of them, and hopefully you're going to reach a lower equilibrium where there will be just less fossil use in your economy. Thing is, you don't know that. We don't know. It's uncertain. The price is set, but the final quantity of fossil energy use is not set, which is a problem if you're a climate scientist, because as I said, we know there's a specific carbon budget and we need to respect it. So a carbon quota would be the opposite. You, instead of just having a set price and a fluctuating quantity, you have a set quantity and a fluctuating price. So you would say, for example, in France, this year, we can only burn that number of barrels. So we're going to split this into quotas. We're going to allocate them one way or another. Could be a universal basic carbon allowance. You can sell part of the quotas to companies and the government that can use them when they buy energies. And every year, you would decrease the total amount of quotas in line with the carbon budget until you reach carbon neutrality. And then there would be a secondary market, a regulated market, where consumers and companies could trade the quotas they don't use, so that they could just reallocate themselves. Here you see you don't really know what will be and end up being the price of these carbon quotas, and you want to make sure that they are highly regulated so that it doesn't just become pure speculation. But whatever you do, you know that no more barrels will be burned, that the quota. That doesn't avoid international rebound. So maybe the barrels you don't burn in France will be burned somewhere else. So that shows also that there needs to be a global international organization of sufficiency to avoid a global rebound effect. But that's one mechanism that's being discussed in the literature.
What about at the level of individuals? Should we talk about carbon allowances at the individual level, one person or a household? Like we had in Romania during communism, we had ration cards for basic groceries. for different reasons, not degrowth, but different reasons. Would this work well and land well with the people, this kind of rations or rationing?
I don't know. We already ration a number of things. For example, organs. If you're if you're sick and you want a new kidney or anything else, you cannot buy it in France, at least not. Yep. You'll be put on a list, and there's a very complex allocation system where very sick people, they can jump the line. If you're a kid, you can jump the line. This kind of stuff, and we ration these scarce resources. So sometime for ecological constraint, we end up in a situation of unpredictable scarcity, droughts in Europe, for example. So in these moments, like, they ration water. So what do? Yeah. Usually they'd be like, you know what? It's forbidden to fill your swimming pool during the following weeks.
In the United States as well. Yeah. Yep.
It's forbidden to just like water your lawn. It's forbidden to water the lawn of a golf, because we want to keep the water for basic hygiene, for drinking, all of that. That makes sense. I think it's not shocking. Here we're not talking green dictature, where actually that can be also self-decided. If within your own house you run out of a specific resource, you're also going to make the decision to ration it, to be like, okay, you know what, we're a bit short on that, so we're going to prioritize that kid that has got a specific needs for that, and then we're going to do this after. So we're used to do rationing for a whole bunch of things. So I think this kind of scarecrow of people saying rationing is just the specter of dictatorship and just impose poverty into the masses, it does not account for the fact that we already ration a lot of things we produced. And actually, capitalism itself is a rationing system through purchasing power. So we ration Ferraris, they're rationed. Not everyone has them. I don't know if you've noticed. I don't have one. If I want a Ferrari, it's simple. I just need a few million euros to buy it. So they're rationed by price.
Right.
Just
so
unless
at the mercy
organs,
of the market. Yeah.
At the mercy of the market. So the question is, like, if we don't need to ration maybe concert, Justin Bieber concert ticket and Ferraris or art paintings, because they're niche, they're not really essential. Who cares at the end of the day if a Justin Bieber concert can be sold for like €1,000? Fine. But if you talk about health, education, housing, access to culture, energy, communication, all of that, I mean, that's no joke. Everyone needs access to these. So the logic of rationing, which is basically a logic of political allocation. So an allocation that can use prices, but regulated prices, because we want to make sure that no one is prevented to access these essential goods and services just because they don't have the money. So right now, I think we've made a bit of a mistake in rationing everything by purchasing power. And now we have an inflation shock. And people are like, oh, we absolutely need to increase purchasing power so that people can pay their rent. We're like, okay, but maybe another way of thinking about it is to decommodify, for example, housing. So take it away from the market, being like, put a cap on the housing prices, be like, okay, no more speculation. Houses, apartments, land is not something you buy with your savings to invest and make money as it is today. It's something whose price is controlled, like it is in social housing, like it is in most of housing in the city of Vienna, because it's something that fulfills basic needs. So it's not something for speculation. If you were to do this, then suddenly you can have affordable housing with a fraction of your purchasing power. And you also are protected against inflationary risk because you have a cap on these prices. So right now, I think that's the challenge, and the inflation crisis is the perfect moment to do this. We should have done this way earlier, under the threat of scarcity brought by climate collapse. But now we get an even more urgent threat with the war and its consequences.
I think this is a perfect segue to the next question, which is about us citizens living in rich countries, or the global north as is known. So for many citizens living in the global north, it is very hard to imagine a life without material growth, right? Be it a bigger house, a better car, better gadgets, or even a higher social status. Capitalism does not leave us much room for self-reflection. talking about the time we spend at work. So what is the most powerful story in the degrowth, let's call it universe, which can uproot this mental inertia of the people in the global north?
Well, here I'm going to point to a book I really like by British philosopher Kate Soper, Post-Growth Living, where she's developing this concept of alternative hedonism. And what I like about her analysis is she's starting from this bold statement that consumerism, this rat race you described for forevermore, is not making us happy. So you would expect that, you know, the accumulation of all these all the wealth we have, and just bigger houses and more cars and all of that and gadgets would just make us like absolutely content. But it does not. It does not in the present, and it does not even in long term. These are my favorite studies, you know, when they ask people, dying people, their regret about life. And they're always the same, regardless of culture and places and classes. Like, I wish I had spent more time with my family. I wish I had worked less. I wish I had, you know, spent more time following my passion, and, you know, less time doing what I thought, what I was told to do by my boss. These kind of, no one says like, I really wish I had earned more money, you know. So now we realize, okay, even though, as you said, like, we do have this powerful discourse around us that defines success as earning more money, as having a lot of prized possessions, and being on a cumulative road to more. But when we think about it so critically, when we get to the bottom of a bunch of whys, we realize that this is not a road to happiness, even less in a world where this only happens for a minority, and even less in a world where the accumulation of a minority of people just leads to the degradation of ecological conditions for all on the planet. So I think the powerful story here is the one about, like, think about the time you will have if you didn't have to work. If you didn't have to work on the things you don't want to work on. Because capitalism is not a system that is well designed to tailor for needs and well-being. So it produces everything that can be sold. So that actually just, we agitate ourselves for a lot of very useless things. I mean, David Graeber, the British anthropologist, you know, he was calling them bullshit jobs. These jobs where even the people performing them, they don't know. They're like, I'm filling Excel sheets, but I have no clue why. Or let me give you my favorite example. People working on search engine referencing. So these, you're a brand, you're going to hire a search engine reference specialist whose goal is to place your brand in as many websites as possible. So when you type the brand on a search engine, it comes first. But hey, every brand has a reference search engine specialist. So they actually compete against each other. They only exist because they have competition. If we had no search engine reference specialist, nothing would change. You would type, and maybe instead of finding H&M or Nike in number 1, you will find it in number 3. And it would just, I don't think it would change a thing. Same thing for like corporate lawyers. Imagine corporate lawyers. I mean, that's a whole swath, a whole profession with people being educated in doing something that is just it's unnecessary. It's self-feeding. The more corporate lawyer you have on one side, the more corporate lawyers you need on the other side to defend. And so we can keep augmenting the number of corporate lawyers, and at the end we'll have a lot, and we'll reach precisely the same position. And as Fred Hirsch wrote in the 70s, you know, when everyone step on their toes, no one sees better. So here we'll be working hellish schedules. We'll have to train in corporate lawyers and referencing techniques, just basically to reach the very same level that we were. And we realize here that well-being is positional. It has in countries that have already built the infrastructure enough to satisfy everyone's needs, then that rat race is positional. When you get first, someone gets second. So the well-being is just balanced. So the story here is to say, like, what about we just escape the rat race? What about we just see the economy as a means of liberating time to do all the kind of stuff we wish we had more time to do. And I think that appeals to people.
I believe it does. And it seems that degrowth covers almost all areas of life, particularly focused on material life. So I would ask you, is in what areas of life would degrowth not apply in the global north?
Okay, here I'm going to be a bit technical and careful, because I try never to use degrowth as a synonym for decrease. So in the same way that when we talk of economic growth, it's a macroeconomic phenomenon. Right. So you don't talk about the economic growth of your income in your bank account, right? No, your money can increase, it can accumulate, you can have more of it. Economic growth is a very specific type of accumulation. It's the one with measure with GDP at the level of an economy as a whole. Same thing, degrowth would be the aggregation of a lot of different decisions that would, when we look at this kind of overall economic agitation, will look like a downward trend. So this is why I don't like this. Otherwise, we fall into these silly debates about like, oh, but should we degrow cooperatives and degrow hospitals? And, of course not. That's not the point. What we need to do is just adapt to the limitedness of energy and materials and available working time, prioritize, stop producing certain things that are very ecologically intensive and that contribute very little to well-being, and just concentrate our limited resources on other things that we can just further develop. Right. So that's the way I would bring it. And let's come back at the individual level. If, for example, and then I'm connecting to a few policies we didn't talk about. If I live in a society where, let's say I live in Vienna and I've got access to affordable housing, so I pay a rent that is 50% the rent that I would pay in London. And I also have like a nice universal healthcare and education system. And I also have a nice secured pension. So I've got these safety nets, okay, that gives me a bit of economic freedom. Then I can I don't have to rush into a job. I could be like, okay, I could work maybe 15 hours of wage work on a specific job, just enough to get the money I need to go around to satisfy my needs. And the rest of the time, you know what? I can just decide to do more of certain things I want. Maybe I want to kickstart a choir in the neighborhood. Maybe my thing is just to start a chess club. Or maybe I love to write Wikipedia articles about degrowth. Can be a bunch of things. And so when we think of degrowth, we have to look at, it's going to be a slowdown of the capitalist monetary economy. That's going to allow to liberate some time for other kind of achievements, even though these achievements, they're not going to generate a financial profit. So they will not show up as wealth in mainstream national accounting. It will create, if you create a chess club, you'll be a volunteer most likely, and you will teach chess to kids in your neighborhood. You're going to create an enormous social wealth because kids, they're going to have access to this activity. Kids, they're also going to make friends. You're going to build trust in the neighborhood. You create a place where kids can go and meet. That's extremely valuable, but no one is going to give you money for that. Okay?
Right.
So we want an economy where we can allow ourselves to have this, to favor the expansion of these activities that create social and ecological wealth, even though they're not financially profitable.
We can move on to some more fun questions.
Ooh.
Next one is there a guideline for a desirable lifestyle for people in the global north that aligns with degrowth? And here is, I mean that how can an individual or a household measure their lifestyle? Can it be in terms of tons of CO2 they emit per year, number of items they buy, number of kilometers they travel, number of kilowatts? Is there one easy metric for degrowth lifestyle that people can use, in their daily life?
One easy metric only, no, because there are several planetary boundaries in the framework. There are 9. If we have to really reduce it, we can think the carbon footprint we know. That's one. You have also material footprint. The carbon footprint is measured in ton of equivalent carbon. So the greenhouse gases you emit in the atmosphere. Right now in France, we are at around 10 ton per person per year. We want to be at 2 ton. So you can calculate your footprint online, and then you can see, oh, well, if you have an average footprint, you will see that the three first element that drives up your footprint is the use of the car, flying, eating your home, and eating meat. So then you can just start making decisions, be like, oh, if I eat 50% less meat, what is going to happen to my carbon footprint? And what you need to do for your carbon footprint, you also need to do for your material footprint, which this time is measured in ton of stuff. So materials is, for example, if you buy a car, you use a car, well, it has taken some carbon to produce the car, and when you're driving it, it emits carbon into the atmosphere, but it also carries a material footprint in the sense that there are a lot of minerals and metals that were necessary to build the actual car. And so this usually, if you really want to simplify, these two ones are the main. So carbon footprint for climate change and material footprint, which is material extraction predetermines most of other environmental pressures. If you're thinking, for example, biodiversity loss, why is biodiversity loss accelerating? Because we destroy more habitat. Why do we destroy the habitat of species? Because we extend industrial agriculture, because we cut down forest. We cut down forest to produce stuff that end up being in the material footprint. And part of that material footprint is the biomass, the actual tree. And so you can link here your material footprint to a specific biodiversity loss footprint, even though then it becomes a bit complicated because biodiversity loss is not a specific budget. Water footprint, we also get used to that one because at the level of municipality during a drought, you roughly know, what kind of levels of water you have. So you have to deal with this. But I would say, like, really to simplify the calculation now, for example, in France, we are at an average of 10 ton, much more than that for the rich people. And we want to get to 2 tons. For material footprint, we are at 18 ton, and we want to get to between 3 and 4 tons.
And is this by 2030 or 50?
So material footprint is by yesterday. So we should have never actually just overpassed the 3 to 4 gigaton footprint, because biodiversity loss, water pollution, this kind of stuff is not like climate change that, oh, by 2050 we need to stop killing, endangered species. It's like, no, actually,
and
we
it's
need to
fine.
stop killing them like now. We need to stop polluting water now. The climate is a slower, it responds, it adapts. So it depends how fast, the question is, depend how fast you want to reduce it. The faster you reduce it and the more you reduce your emissions, the more probable it is you're going to maintain global warming under a threshold. So that's what the IPCC calculate. If you reduce all of that by 2030, well, that's fantastic. That's going to give you a very high chance, more than 80% maybe, to stick to 1.5 degrees. If you don't, if you do it by 2040, then maybe you're going to have a 50% chance to have this, but rather most likely you're going to reach 2 degrees warming. If you do it by 2100, then you're going to have a lot of warming, because climate change is the result of accumulated emissions. So every extra emissions is going to work out in just accelerating climate change. So it depends how serious we are about it. But from reading the IPCC reports and being freaked out by my climate scientist friend on a daily basis, it seems like as fast as possible seems like a wise course of action, especially for rich countries, because it's not like we have to choose between eating and just reducing our footprint. It's just it's still going to be a life that's going to be very comfortable. It's just, of course, we're going to need to spend a lot of time reorganizing the way we work, the way we produce, the way we move, the way we live. But the faster we do it and the bigger we do it in the global north, the more chance we give to the global south to have options. And these options, this window of opportunity is closing now. When you have some land desertifying in a global south country, when you have fisheries that collapse, when you have an ancient forest that being burned down, these things you cannot get back. And also there's this whole unpredictability. I'm going to give you one example that I find rather shocking. So for a decade, some companies have told the story of carbon compensation. They're like, no, it's actually fine to fly. When you fly, you can just have this little box, carbon compensation, and you pay like whatever, an extra euro, and that compensate. And basically that company is just giving money to a company somewhere that is promising to build to plant a tree that somehow over the course of its lifetime is going to absorb the emission of your flight. And everyone is like, well, that sounds cool. Then, we can fly more and more. We just have to compensate. And then you get a forest fire. And all that carbon in that monocultural forest that got no resilience whatsoever and that just burns in 5 seconds has been completely canceled and ends up in the atmosphere. So here we realize that degrowth, as I see it, is a fail-safe, like it's the safe way of mitigating global warming. And I think my killer argument, and I haven't heard anyone debunking this, so if you're critical of degrowth and you're listening to this, this is your moment to shine. Whatever we advocate, all the policies that you can see there, if you decide to stop eating meat right now, or to stop watering golf courses, or to stop taking the plane, and at some point we realize that, oh, well, actually, we have a bit more carbon to spare. So, well, we can fly a bit more. Then you can fly a bit more. We know how to do it. It's fine. What's the risk? On the opposite, if we be like, no, we can fly, it's fine. We'll find some magic technology that can suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and you don't, then you're screwed 1,000%. So anything that has to do with social organization is pretty much reversible. We were talking about rationing. We put in place water rationing during a drought, and then we just stop it when the water comes back. So same thing, but if you degrade a water source to the point where actually the ecosystem services die because, your glacier is going to just melt, or you disrupt the course of the river, or, population of pollinators are just going to collapse, then that's something you will just never get back.
I will pick up on that, Tim, and I'll switch the gears a little bit towards politics. So how do you feel about a Degrowth International of many civic groups that have in common a counter-hegemonic agenda? Namely, they are specifically anti-consumerist and perhaps even openly anti-capitalist. And can you also define the word hegemony for us, and perhaps with some historical references? It's used a lot in the degrowth literature.
Okay, I'll start with this.
Yeah.
So the term hegemony was made famous by Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci. And what he made by hegemony is an idea that becomes dominant in society. So it's often also equated to ideology or common sense. So right now, when we say that capitalism is a hegemonic mode of economic organization, it means that it has become common sense. So I could also tell you that wage labor is a hegemonic form of work because it's the dominant one. If you say, I'm going to go and work, people assume you're going to, be in a situation of employment where your employer is going to pay you a wage to perform some work. They're not going to think that you're going to just, I'm going to go some work and you plant vegetables and pay yourself with local currency or do something else. That those exist, but they're peripheral. Right. And so when we're thinking about challenging hegemony is to identify dominant discourses that exist in societies that we may have stopped to be critical towards. Like GDP, perhaps we realize that, I've never really thought about it. I feel like, increasing GDP was good. It was like natural. I actually felt that economies naturally just do things that just make them grow. So I've never really politicized the term. And then all of a sudden you're like, but actually growth itself, the growth discourse is a hegemonic ideology, but there are other discourses that exist in periphery of that ideology. If you've seen The Matrix, the difference between an hegemonic discourse, ideology, and other discourses is basically the red pill, blue pill. So the blue pill is the common sense. You swallow it and you see the matrix. You only see what the software wants you to see. You see hegemony. You consent to live in that factus world. If you take the red pill, then you see, that discourse from outside. And so that's in my thesis for philosopher nerds that will listen to us. I use a fantastic theory by Karl Mannheim about the dialectic between ideology as dominant discourse and utopias as alternative discourse that strive to replace ideology. And today, what I do in the thesis is framing degrowth as a utopian discourse trying to dethrone, the growth ideology. For me, this is one of the main discursive battle in the field of sustainability today between the ideology of growth and the utopia of degrowth.
So linking back to the question about the Degrowth International, is there a narrative that can bring people together from various groups and organizations that have this counter-hegemonic agenda? Do you see anything?
It's been happening a bit in the sense of degrowth has gained an impressive popularity in just many different countries, even in global south countries. So it's just it's picked up momentum, and it has also created many alliances with other alternative discourses. I'm thinking of ecofeminism. I'm thinking of eco-socialism, different strands of communism. And so it seems that degrowth, which is much more specific, is rather specific and new concept, has been a nice platform to revitalize these discussions. Should that lead to a degrowth international? I don't know. Should it be a degrowth international or an eco-socialist international or an anti-extractivist international or a post-capitalist international or an eco-feminist international? I'm not sure degrowth as the kind of be the best concept of it all. It's part of a pluriverse in a constellation of concept. It's also very specific to it. So far, it's done a job very well of just empowering these alternative discourse and practices to be actually, we are part of the solution. So it's been a concentrating effort to criticize capitalism, but also go a bit further than that, the traditional Marxist critique of capitalism, by also criticizing extractivism, commercialism, productivism, consumerism, neoliberalism, utilitarianism, a lot of different associated ideologies. So traditionally, Marxists criticized capitalism for being an unfair mode of production. And so they advocated for a democratization of the means of production. And so, but for them, in traditional Marxist thinking, then you will be even more productive if you do that. There'll be a better mode of production and you will be able to just produce some more. And that has changed, of course, recently with eco-Marxist and eco-socialist, adding this kind of limitedness of a mode of production by being we will be able to satisfy needs better, but we won't be able to create, unlimited production. So that's what has been argued by, luxury communist, fully automated luxury communism. So, I think here there's been this divide, and now eco-socialist and now eco-socialist degrowth. I'm sure you've heard about this convergence in the last few months.
Yes.
It's a nice alliance of concepts.
Right. To stay a little bit on the ideology side, if a careful reader unpacks degrowth, it sounds very much like socialism at the first glance. Degrowth is more of a tool. It does have an ideological arm or branch. I want to ask you, is it socialism per se, that ideological branch of degrowth, or is it something else in terms of ideology? And that's because due to media propaganda, degrowth is a hard sell for the right wing. If we stay on the politics side. And can it be packaged in such a way that it overcomes this cognitive dissonance in the conservative mind to avoid associations with the Soviet Union, North Korea, you know?
Yeah.
I do know a lot of conservative people, and when I tell them Degrowth, oh, socialism, but the bad kind of socialism.
Yeah. I mean, you could wrap your way around it by just using, well-being economy. It's a regenerative mode of production. It's a perma-circular, a way of producing. But truth is, like, looking at things as an economist, like what defines a socialist mode of production compared to a capitalist mode of production, what degrowthers advocate is very close from socialism. I mean, as Yorgos Kallis writes, it's basically socialism without growth. So it's kind of like a eco-socialism 2.0, integrating like a few new updates. So I don't think we can frame it differently to avoid this kind of the specter of historically, like of historical failures of communism and socialism, but I don't think in fact we can avoid it. And that also because, like, there can be an infinity of different economic systems, in the sense that economies of diverse, and there's always many different institutions and practices and discourse coexisting at the same time. But if you're thinking about a business, it's pretty much always the same. Business is just a bunch of people. They're going to just mobilize resources. There's going to be some time and effort to just produce something else. And then they're going to give that thing they've produced to someone. Then they can sell it, they can give it, they can allocate it, they can do that. They can pay the people with money. They can, you can do this in a few different ways, but not like infinitely either. So just if we're looking at the kind of business model that is being discussed within the degrowth literature, the not-for-profit cooperative, or the commons, association of people that gather with a raison d'être that focuses on the satisfaction of concrete needs, and that democratically, in the most participative way possible, make the decisions of what to produce and how to produce it. Okay, and they do this with a common. So within a common, it means that the property, then we come back to classic Marxist division, you have a collective ownership of the means of production. So you would say, like, oh yeah, that's socialism. But a company where you have a collective ownership of the means of production, where collective means, a few people in the neighborhood, or collective means a federation of governance within a region, or collective means a state-run enterprise, you see that those are very different kinds of socialism. So I don't think the debate I find between, like, is it socialism or capitalism, is very black and white. It's very like Cold War style, like, almost as if inventing the economy of the future was like a multiple choice questionnaire was just like 2 boxes. Like, no, we have colors. There's just many different types of capitalism, many different types of socialism historically, and many more in between to be invented.
Yeah, the binary thinking is very strong and prevalent on my continent, as you can probably see in the politics of the United States. So it's very hard to avoid this binary thinking. So it's good that we can bring nuance to this kind of separation. But on this note, would you personally call yourself an eco-socialist, or you avoid labels for yourself, political labels?
Yeah, I avoid political labels because, as you can see, this is my office at the university, and I never leave it. So I'm a university rat.
There.
So I define myself. I'm an ecological economist. So I'm a social. I'm a specific breed of social scientist, and my daily job is to try to better understand how the economy works, especially in relation with nature and many other things. And that most of what I do. I want to try to better understand how capitalism works. I want to try to, especially more importantly, understand how alternative to capitalism could work in theory, and how they do work in practice. But that is most of what I do. Of course, there are political motivations of doing that, but most of my existence is being a scientist, even though that science is not just out of curiosity. I'm not like, oh, wow, I'm so curious about how to dismantle capitalism. What an interesting little question. We're not doing Sunday philosophy. I do this because I sense the urge that we need to do it. If there was just no climate crisis, I would just be here writing books about academic writing, like extremely nerdy stuff. That's what I would do for pleasure, or theoretical physics, or like really, quote unquote, not useless, but let's say other things.
Yeah, I would like to press this idea just a little bit, Tim, if you don't mind, because I see a lot of science communicators outside ecology, even in physics and biology, all that. There are many around with podcasts, YouTube channels. So they talk about space exploration, telescopes, and all that, but they avoid having a political slant on what they talk about, almost like they would never touch what we talked about, the capitalist hegemony. Elon Musk kind of entrepreneurs shooting rockets into the orbit. All these scientific endeavors do have a political background and a political footprint on society. It's very hard to avoid them, right? So the question would be about responsibility of scientists. Many climate scientists have just left the office and took on activism, which is great. There's many of them. Should this responsibility taken more by other scientists as well, like be politically engaged and have opinions about how the economy is organized?
I think scientists have a responsibility first and foremost because we are we're at top of the Everest of privilege. Well-paid jobs in places of power, a lot of people listening to us. And so if right now I were to tell you like, oh, I'm just going to focus on writing a book about the sexual life of Adam Smith, they'll be like, what? So you've been trained in ecological economics. We're in the midst of like a potential climate breakdown, and you're going to just waste your time on that useless.
My house is on fire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have a responsibility in the choice of our research questions, which should not only be driven by curiosity, but also by societal needs. So that's true for everyone. That's especially true for social scientists. And if you're an economist, then that's even truer, because the economist, as I argue in my thesis and in my book, is the core engine of the crisis we face. So the way I see it is like, imagine a game of Monopoly with your friends. You're playing this, and all of a sudden someone is choking and they're just dying. And then you're like, oh, I wonder what happens if we were to swap this street with this street. Yeah, let's do an experiment. It's like, no, like there's no point to better understand how that system works. Like if we cannot solve that problem, there's just not going to be any players to play because they're going to be dead. Same thing if you play Monopoly within a house on fire, to jump back on your analogy. So let's just extinguish the fire, and then we will focus on how to just handle the fake money and everything.
And read the books and read the articles and strategize. Yep.
So the way I do it is by paying close attention to concrete problems that need solving. Because we've got limited attention. And so you may have known my work on decoupling and green growth, for example. So I've spent a bit of time, too much, most probably, just debunking silly economic theories from old economists. And I feel like this job has been done. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life working on that. Like, first, that would be an overkill, and then that would be a waste of my time. And then now,
how about the green growth idea? Does it merit more attention, or we finish with dismantling the?
It's finished.
It's finished, right?
I think anyone right now arguing that we can have green growth is someone that just has not looked at the numbers hard enough. Is someone that is just was not serious.
Yeah, fair enough.
And that happens to many different people. Last week, Paul Krugman tweeted the very same tweet he tweeted last summer in 2021, celebrating the achievement in UK, because according to a graph he found on a blog online, emissions per inhabitants are down back to the levels of the 50s. the 1850s. So, and therefore, as we should understand by the graph, then we're on our way to just mitigate climate change. So when you've spent more than 5 minutes doing climate economics, you know that this is nonsense. Like, this is flat earth theory kind of thinking. So Paul Krugman is an impressive economist on many accounts. Climate economics is definitely not one of them. So, but you see that in the summer of 2019, when a bunch of colleagues and I published Decoupling, Debunked, that report was very arrogant on purpose. You know, I wrote it with an arrogant bite because I was like, I mean, if a PhD student can debunk your theory of green growth, your theory of green growth must be kind of crap. And so we wrote the report, and I really made sure in the writing that there was a bite of like, okay, show me I'm wrong and I'll change my mind. It's been 3 years. No one has knocked on my door, and I've published many different things since. A couple of times, someone there sending me a paper, being like, look, what about this data? Can be shut down in 5 seconds. Every single debate I've been to has been a joke, with people not even knowing the literature they're talking about. So I think people now, there's still a few books being written about green growth, but they're just broad, abstract appeal to technology without defining it, without not using data to measure it. They're not serious pieces of scholarship. And actually, if you read the latest IPCC report and you talk to the authors of studies being cited in the IPCC report on the issue of decoupling, they are pretty much all very skeptical of the discourse of green growth.
Do you want to say anything about eco-modernism since we're on this topic? You don't have to if you don't want.
Well, I'm not going to create a box of eco-modernism, because I think there's just, what I'm focusing here is not on eco-modernist, is on anyone that believes that somehow we can keep producing and consuming more and also reduce ecological footprints in the plural, meaning we can keep producing and consuming more everywhere at the same time and use less water, use less energy, emit less greenhouse gases, use less minerals and materials. That theory is fake news. It's, you know, a reptilian conspiracy of some kind. And so unless someone shows me some proof and, you know, that really concerning, well-built ways of showing that we've been wrong on this issue, that the IPCC has been wrong in the way there's been talking about this, and, you know, then we can reopen the debate. But until now, we're going to move on to other things more urgent.
Let's talk more about action, because this is, I think, the burning question and desire in most of our viewers. Like, they feel we need to do something. Can a symbolic civic act of silent disobedience, something like the Salt March of Gandhi, on a small scale, can trigger a degrowth revolution? And what is your perception of the popular feelings towards degrowth and outside academia? I'm trying to do something here locally in Toronto, so this is my motivation.
I don't know much about that, because, as I said, I've mainly stayed at university, so you would need to ask like the people that have been part of these movements, that I think will know way better, you know, what's happening on the ground. Some people published a book that listeners might want to check out. It's called Degrowth and Strategy.
Yes.
And it links up to an impressive amount of stories and effort that has been made on making degrowth a reality. There's also the book Degrowth in Movements, another edited volume published in 2020, that is just inviting 20-something different movements on the topic to express themselves on the topic of degrowth. So that's the people that wrote these kind of contributions are the people you might want to contact to get more of the inside stories of degrowth as a social movement, because for me, I've been observing it from the outside. What I can say concerning civil disobedience as an observer, and here I'm going to talk more of a citizen, so I'm going to switch, and it's not something I've been studying as a scientist, but it's something that has been inspiring me as an activist. So watching engineers in France call for desertion. So there's been a wave of calls for desertion this year in many top of the nation engineering schools. Recent graduates basically saying like, no more. We don't want to be used as servant to destroy the planet. We don't want to become the minions of global corporation being exploited and just, bribed with money so we destroy the living world. We won't do it. Actually, we want to use our skills and time to improve the world, to help solve problems that matter. And so this act of desertion from capitalism, to be like, that's a no, I refuse to participate in that exploitation. It's a very strong attitude, which here applies when you're an engineer refusing to work for Shell or refusing at Shell to participate in a certain project, but can also happen in many different different ways. So civil disobedience is going to be a necessary strategy at this point, because, as you say, capitalism has become such an hegemonic discourse, such a grinding routine, that we need to create a space for reflection, what Serge Latouche was calling, decolonization of the imaginary. And these acts of civil disobedience, they're very powerful because they create cracks in the social imaginary. They stop time, social time for, and like, oh, wow, wait a second. Is it right that a whole generation of engineers been trained to do planned obsolescence? Wait a second. What about we refuse to do that? And then all of a sudden, we make this a societal discussion. It's like, why are we doing planned obsolescence in the first place? I hate it when my washing machine breaks. The engineer hate designing washing machine that breaks. And the climate scientists, they just yell at us because we want to actually have more durable washing machines and reduce material footprint and water footprint and everything. So, and then we realize actually planned obsolescence only exists so that it can enrich a minority of shareholders. They're like, oh wow, how did we end up all just being part of a discourse and a practice at the interest of a minority of people that is doing something at the expense of everyone else? So these acts of civil disobedience, even though when you see them, they don't look like much. You're like, oh, a bunch of people, Extinction Rebellion, have blocked a bridge or a highway for an hour or so, or maybe a scientist has glued himself to a bank, or all kind of stuff. But there are moments of suspension in the social imaginary. There are rare little moments where you get, a glitch in the matrix. You see, like, oh, you see some things like, wait a second, I felt I saw something. Like I've seen beyond the veil of reality, of hegemonic reality. So they're very important, not only because they empower us to take control of the economy, to be like, we can be actors of change. And then that can become a self-feeding mechanism where you empower others to also do so, until the point where we actually all refuses, the majority of us, to participate in the destruction of the living world, and then that stops. We stop making capitalism.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about emotions, because in these times we live with strong emotions with all the right spectrum, like from anxieties about the climate, about jobs, cynicism about the future, about solutions, nihilism. So these govern the daily life of a middle-class global North citizen like myself, not to mention the bottom 50% of people by income, if we look at Piketty's tables. So can degrowth channel these emotions towards transformation, like we talked about disobedience? And in what way? Is it more about stories or communication, doing things?
I think the doing things is what was most important for me. So as an economist, of course, I'm always very curious. I mean, I've been curious since I was a kid. I'm still curious every single time I use a credit card. My brain is racing, and I'm imagining what's happening here when you use a credit card. What's the specific relation you have with the cashier when you go to the supermarket? All of these things, that, like, what kind of job contract they have and how that self-define their identity. And I once, 2015, I think, I went to a climate camp, a link to a civil disobedience action in Eastern Germany, near Leipzig. And I was in that camp that for 10 days they have this self-organized little nice community of 1,000 activists just gathering in the middle of a field or an abandoned village. And you have to self-organize all many different things. You have to produce food 3 times a day for 1,000 people. You have to handle sewage, toilet stuff. You have to make sure to have health specialists and doctors and all of that. All of this with just people that just show up. And when you go there, you make the experience of playing a different economic game. So you feel it. I give you an example. You arrive on camp on the first day, and you see everyone activating, doing something. Some build tents, other they just chop down food, and I think the first thing you feel is like, how can I help? Because I feel a bit useless. I'm here, and I'm not going to sit down and read a book. And so you have the experience of basically what unemployment feels, being excluded from production. Society telling you, you're useless, just we don't need you. But we see that in that economy, everything is very open. So when someone wants to participate, you always find a way for them to participate, regardless of their skills, regardless of what needs to be done. It's always, a very inclusive manner. And it works with a little self-organized hippie village of 1,000 people, but the principles still hold for a huge macroeconomy of a few million. So when you make the experience of that nice little inclusive way of considering employment as qualitative participation in a community, it changes you. And then when I come back to my computer and on my Excel sheet, I see numbers about national employment and unemployment, I'm like, well, there's just more than this to the question of work. So I think this embodied knowledge is very important. This is why, like, these social experiments, this utopian lab, this now-utopias, like some people say, eco-villages, hippie communes, summer camp, where we go and we experiment an alternative to capitalism. They're so important because we create embodied knowledge, cultural knowledge about an alternative world. We educate our desire for something 100%. Else that we either didn't know we wanted or didn't know what was possible to want.
Right.
So right now, if I were, I finished with this. If I were a government, actually even 20 years ago, when you start to realize that we may at some point hit a wall, that there's a risk. Okay, we know. So we're going to finance anyone that is willing to join a hippie commune, to do a not-for-profit cooperative, to create a local currency. All of that, you guys, we're going to create a space where you have the resources you need. We secure your remuneration. Here's some time. Here's some help. Here's some platforms. You do what you do, because what you guys are just growing alternatives. And the day the main system crashes, then we have this to rely on. I think today we are just realizing in a state of terror that we've been investing all of our hopes in one system, and now very slowly we come to realize that that system doesn't work anymore, that perhaps it's never really worked, and that it's definitely not going to work in the future. And they were like, okay, what's the plan B? And then imagine, like, people looking at each other around the table and they're like, what do you mean plan B? We have no plan B. So now I think that's, and I'm connecting back to the popularity of degrowth, social movements, even decision makers, companies. Many people appreciate the fact that there's been a couple of lunatics that for the last 20 years and even more, I spent some time theorizing and practicing alternatives to capitalism. Not only, of course, degrowthers, many people have done that, but now this experience and this knowledge is one of our most precious thing for the transition.
Personally, I think the key towards social ecological transformation is this shift in individual self-awareness and a shift in emotions towards altruism and solidarity. So we talked about the imperial mode of living in the global north, and I think it cannot be overcome without this individual awakening. And this leads me to a tough question, I think. Can we get to this transformation without a severe crisis, like major climate breakdown, like you said, a war, a global strike, or major supply chain breakdowns?
I don't know. I'm tempted to say no.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not a qualified historian. You would need to look at many different how revolution happens, and so this is not a qualified knowledge based answer. But from the very few years I've been just observing society reacting to the concept of degrowth,
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult not to notice that the concept is getting popular at moments of crisis. So Serge Latouche himself explains that degrowth became so popular in the beginning of the 2000s in France because of the 2003 heat wave, which was a
Okay.
very big thing in France. And so that raised a lot of awareness. Right now, I'm sure the pandemic now has just also raised a lot of awareness. I'm sure the drought in Europe is going to raise a lot of awareness. In these moments of suspension, we realize that business as usual cannot continue. Of course, here we need to bring back power relations to be like, who realizes that? If you're in your chalet in Zurich and you're reading about the drought and you're like, yeah, okay, it's a very abstract kind of disaster. So I think a minority of very privileged decision makers, like the one who owns companies, who just CEO of them, they are, by their imperial mode of living, protected from that realization. They're so distant from realizing the impact of climate change, for example. Hence the importance of democracy. I mean, where we're deciding this stuff, it should be the most vulnerable people that just have, more voice in the balance because they have skin in the game. Quite literally, their skin is in the game. So right now, when I see all the importance we give to what Elon Musk is doing, what the CEO of Total think about what should be done about the energy sufficiency, I'm like, screw this. Like, when we organize a United Nation Cup, instead of just being in awe and just waiting for the speech of the Chinese, American, and European presidents and ministers, we should just give twice more time to island nations, to the people that are suffering the risk of climate change, because they're the one that will take the issue most seriously. So I feel, I'll stop here.
I'll move in a moment to shorter questions, but just maybe quickly on this one. Do you think we need to popularize more the word degrowth with everything that comes with it, policies and etc., or just focus on a specific set of policy or even one, like basic income, for example? What's more strategic?
Definitely not one policy. I mean, we've wasted valuable years among leftists, I think, disagreeing on like what's the best silver bullet to kill capitalism. Is it a universal basic income, or is that a universal basic service? Why would it not be both?
Yeah.
So now we have toolboxes, the 380 instruments we listed with my colleagues. We have these toolboxes. It's not a matter of deciding which one is the silver bullet. There's no magical policy to do anything. It's just a matter of like acupuncture, a lot of different points we need to touch with a lot of different kind of needles. And there's no way to predict how that's going to go. So you may want to have all kind of tools around you so you can just adapt to the situation. So that's the first thing. Then is that it doesn't need to be around the term degrowth. Now, like, degrowth is suffering from its own fame. There's not been a marketing strategy to make degrowth, one of the coolest anti-capitalist term. It has just become like this with, I think, the context. Yeah. So now we need to use that energy. The discussions that are happening now in the degrowth literature, in degrowth movements, are outstandingly interesting. They're really just precious discussions, precious little just insights are being produced around degrowth discussion. As soon as a concept, as long as it produces interesting insights, as long as it motivates people to talk to each other and to find new solutions to old problems, then it works. So far, let's keep surfing, let's keep riding the degrowth wave, but let's also not fetishize the term, Nobody really care what it's called. At the end of the day, these
Yeah.
concepts, if they stop to enlighten, in the sense, if they stop to help us to understand social reality and ways of solving problems that matter to us, then they become obstacles and we dump them. Green growth, I think, is the perfect example of a concept that obscures. Like, it's just gives a false illusion. It's a blue pill kind of concept. So right now we need more red pill kind of concepts.
Yeah, and we don't want to build a degrowth religion. Who's going to be the degrowth pope? Let's do a little bit, a few short objections to degrowth. I call them the devil advocate objections. So let's do number one. It would say none of the degrowth proposals are realistic. The ruling class is too powerful, and they will never give up power and wealth. So how would you answer this objection?
First, my answer would be, what's your alternative?
Mm-hmm.
It's like in Matrix, if you start by saying like, no guys, I mean, you'll never defeat the robot anyway. So, and then
cross our hands and do nothing. Yep.
Exactly. I think it's just a matter of how. Social structures are plastic. Everything that has been socially constructed can be socially constructed. It's just a matter of finding how. And also I think the peculiarity of fossil capitalism is that it's enriching a very tiny minority at the expense of a very large majority. So we have numbers on our side. With numbers come, thinking and acting power. So yes, you're right. There's a minority of very rich people that may not be too stoked about the idea of giving up their profit and, not having private jets anymore and these kind of stuff. Can these privileges be overcome? Yes. Have that happened before in the past? Yes. I'm not going to be the French guy bringing French history here, but everyone can use their favorite example. So I'm actually quite an optimist on this. I think, that I don't remember who said it, but realism is realism is the kind of the discourse of cowards. I think it was the quote of just being like, oh, it's not realistic, it'll never happen. This discourse is actually legitimizing the power of people who have it. I have more of a kind of utopian thinking also means like being bold in dreaming not only alternative societies, but also dreaming ways of getting there. And sometimes some of them can turn into self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think we see many of those these days. I mean, look at the lying flat movement in China. Fantastic story. In June 2021, one guy publishes an anonymous manifesto calling for the young generation to lay flat, to be like, we don't want to participate in the rat race anymore. Doesn't make us happy, destroy the living world. Let's lay flat. And that started a movement in China. So, as you can imagine, the manifesto was not covered on the news, and it was just censored as much as you can censor something. Became a movement. So who knows what's going to be the next movement, and what movement is to create another movement, and who knows what will happen the day these movements would create an alliance together to dethrone the hegemonic ideology of growth and capitalism.
Yeah, here's when the devil's advocate comes back with another objection and says that degrowth is against human nature, so to pursue it, it's useless. Now, this is the human nature question.
So let's come back to what growth and degrowth was. So increasing GDP is part of human nature. Or rather, someone would say, human nature make us do things that will always result in an increase of GDP, which sounds a bit like a dubious theory, since GDP was invented in the 1930s and is a very specific indicators almost no one knows how to calculate. So I think most of the people making this thing, well, a dubious understanding of human nature at first, perhaps, but then definitely a dubious understanding of what growth is. I would agree with them on one point. if there's one unshakable fact about human nature, perhaps let's admit this, is that we're always striving to improve our conditions. That's what we do. We try to solve problems and we try to, strive toward having a better life. But depending on where society you live, depending on what position you have in that society, you're not going to have the same vision of progress. You're not going to have the same dreams. You're not going to have the same thing. So your problem's not going to be the same. So we're all striving to improve our situations, but improving the situation means many different things. Actually, I would argue that right now, human nature will force us to improve our situations by reducing production and consumption so we don't die in a climate collapse. I think that survival instinct is something you could very easily link to human nature. So is human nature stronger for survival instinct and not die in a forest fire, something like this, or of a global pandemic, something which is perhaps an older fear? Or is human nature greed is good and you want to accumulate money points?
So you can probably tell where I'm coming from with this objection. It's mostly used by the conservatives about the human nature argument that is behind capitalism. If you don't mind, can we move to more, let's say, personal questions, more about your interests and your projects? I know you have a book coming up. Can you tell us more about the book, and will it come in English at some point?
Well, I hope so. It'll come in French first. It's called Ralentir ou périr, l'économie de la décroissance, slow down or perish, the economics of degrowth, come in mid-September. And it's basically a wide audience synthesized version of the thesis. Slightly improved, I would say. So everything I've developed in the thesis is slightly improved in the book because I published the thesis in 2020.
Does it have fewer lists?
I mean, you know me. So it has better list, more parsimonious list. So I've managed to, let's say, for example, my 7 limits of green growth has become 5 limits of green growth.
Okay.
So I'm improving my list a bit.
Even easier to remember them.
Exactly. If it works well in French, I do hope that it will be translated in English. In any case, I'm working already on a second book, this time in English. That is going to be even more ambitious than the first, because that first was just really just taking stock of what I've developed in the thesis and presenting this in a way that is accessible to non-economists, even to non-scholars. I think that was one of the responsibility of scientists. They need to explain what they've discovered. So I've done that. Now the book that I'm developing now in English, it's about cutting edge problems in degrowth. So all those tough questions you may have heard, like what does degrowth mean in terms of international trade, geopolitics, inflation and price levels, financing the welfare state, all these tough economic problems standing in the way of degrowth. So now I'm working in cracking them. Well, trying to crack them. So kind of really working on the transition and trying to advance, not only repeat, but now like identifying the problems that are just blocking us and trying to solve them. So that's what one part of what I'm working on. And that connects to my official research at university, which is part of a program called Post-Growth Welfare System at Lund University in Sweden, where I'm working on the financing of public services during a degrowth transition.
Is your second book more for a popular audience? Does it have the academic flavor about it?
First book is wide audience. The second one will be a bit more technical, I think. Okay. A bit more aimed to a scholarly audience, even though I don't believe in, academy's jargon-full abstract writing for the sake of it. I do enjoy writing poetry, but I try not to mix this with my scientific work. So I do think any book you write, even though it's an economics book, should be accessible to someone that, is willing to read nonfiction. So that's always my rule of writing.
How do you personally engage with fashion and your material footprint? Do you ever go outside your comfort zone and engage with family, friends, and social circles to try to persuade them to switch to degrowth?
No, that's the short answer. Okay. I've had, as many of you may have had, horrible Christmas dinner conversation around climate change. I think at some point you need to accept the fact that I can inspire many different people to change their habits, but inspiring my own family to do that is going to be sometimes very tricky. So I don't want to get stuck in trying to, not pollute, but let's say put a lot of pressure on my friendships and my family relationship just to change the behavior of a handful of people.
Right.
So I rather focus on general scientific work, broad statement, and let the people, react to these statements and numbers and apply it to themselves. I don't want to become a degrowth coach for specific people. I think
Guru.
people can do that on their own. That's actually one of the first value of degrowth, like autonomy. So people need to autonomously do their own journey.
Favorite economists, alive or not?
Wow. I didn't see that one coming.
Yeah.
Favorite economist, alive or not?
And they can be from the opposing camp. I don't mind.
Yeah, well, the first one that come to mind is Herman Daly. Overall, because reading is The Economics of Sustainable Development, his 1996 book, is the one book that led me to go into ecological economics. So I think without that book, I would have never diverged from mainstream economics. And who knows why they had a copy of that book in my mainstream economics university. Was the kind of only thing there. And I found it randomly, stumbled upon it, read it, completely changed my mind. So I will forever be in debt to Herman Daly from opening that door for me. People that want to discover the life work of Herman Daly, which is an endless pit of wonders, can read Peter Victor has just published a biography of Herman Daly. That is splendid. So I highly recommend it. It's a mind shifter.
Have you spoken to either of them?
I've never spoken to Herman. I know Peter, and we've spoken a few times, and I really like him. And Peter has also been a very inspiring economist. I mean, he single-handedly created the field of ecological macroeconomics. So that's also quite some achievement. But maybe I'll get to meet Herman, one day. It'll be fun.
Favorite authors of all time, and do you have time to read fiction or anything non-academic?
Favorite author of all time. Now, that's embarrassing because I've told you I'm an academic writing nerd. And so what I read for pleasure, even though I do read novels, especially utopian novels, because they're the one that really project me outside of capitalism. It's a huge source of inspiration for creating this embodied knowledge. But what I prefer to read, my absolute favorite books of all, are books about writing. And my Bible is actually a very short book called Economical Writing by Deirdre McCloskey. It's actually the book I've bought most time. I think I've bought in my life more than 60 copies of that book, because every time I stumble upon someone in dire needs of having a hard look at their writing, I buy the book. I ask for their address. I buy the book. I send it to them. The book gives you 35 rules to improve your academic writing, written by one of the most inspiring wordsmith. I mean, Deirdre McCloskey is also a highly celebrated economist. So she's not only just a fantastic writer, she's also an impressive thinker. So that's what I will mention here. Instead of novels, books on academic writing, to discover that subtle art that is to just somehow put words together to build theories. I mean, it's something fantastic.
How do you organize your work to stay on top of everything?
I make lists. You know it.
Lists, perfect.
I've got a list of everything. I realize science is 98% making lists of things. So I've got list of my list, and I've got list of my list of list. and it's list all the way down Inception style. And that's how I just can. And then I do something else, which if you're a PhD student and you feel a bit lost in yourself in that grand task of writing a PhD thesis, here's the one thing that really helped me writing mine. I mean, you may know my PhD thesis is rather long and I had to write it rather fast. So I kept a diary, a thought diary. So every time I start a new project, every single thought is recorded in a document. And then you regularly comment on your own thoughts. Okay? One wave of like, oh, last month I was thinking this. I've discovered that, but I wonder if. And so you create in that diary a conversation between you from the past, you in the present, and you in the future. So basically you turn your mind from the power of one to the power of three people. Are you going to end up insane with need for therapy? Maybe, but you're going to write a great thesis. So yeah, putting writing, and then we go back to the beauty of writing, which is not only a way of recording something that you've thought like, oh, I've got an idea, I write down not to forget. No, the act of writing itself is the emergence of thoughts. It's a parallel form of consciousness. And so a PhD diary is not only just a way not to forget, it's a way to systematically think. And so that's my advice for PhD students.
Even as I'm a fiction writer myself, and I can totally relate with this. Yeah. How can people find your work? I know you're present on Twitter, and maybe you can plug in your website and anything you wish. And then I have a surprise for you.
Fantastic. So yeah, Twitter, I've got this website where I'm sharing some of my list, not all of them. Otherwise, I think everyone will realize I'm kind of crazy, but just the sufficient amount of them. And then, yeah, there's a contact form. So do feel free to get in touch if you need anything specific or just to share one of your story or if you want to chat.
Okay, sounds good. Awesome.
What's the surprise?
This is a surprise. I have some rapid fire questions. So feel free to try to
surprise.
Yeah, but these are rapid fire, so feel free to to answer with less of it, more of it, about the same, or it depends. So I'll just shoot at you a few words and you try to answer them. So climate crisis documentaries, less of it, more of it, about the same, or it depends.
I mean, hopefully less of it, none of it, because we realize that the climate crisis is so urgent, we don't need to watch forests burn. We just do something about it. But until we get there, more of it.
Okay. Bitcoin.
Less of it. I mean, look at the carbon footprint of the thing. It's nonsense.
Yeah. Elon Musk.
Less of it. Absolutely. His carbon footprint is gigantic. And, the space race in itself is also a gigantic waste of resource. I mean, space tourism, I think in 100 years, when we'll look back at that moment where we were actually literally putting the planet on fire, and there was a couple of rich dudes organizing holidays in a few minutes, holidays in space, we would just, cry in shame.
And billionaires in general?
Less of it. I mean, I think we would all be better off, even billionaires, living in a society without billionaires.
100%. Worker strikes.
More of it. In this great task of civil disobedience, we have somehow to just stop the wheels of capitalism, and sometimes that just takes a strike. And I'm just not only saying this because I'm French.
Sounds good. Large-scale sports tournaments. You can imagine anything.
Oh, wow. I've just recently tweeted something very negative about the World Cup, whose footprint is also gigantic. And I'm not sure also right now is the moment to just, burn a lot of precious barrels to just watch people play balloon on grass. So I would want to say less of it for now.
Okay. Trains.
More of it. I don't fly and I travel a lot. I did my PhD between Barcelona, Clermont-Ferrand, and Stockholm. I can tell you that's a long train ride, and that's a lot of trains. And so we need to bring back sleeper trains. I want sleeper trains everywhere. I'm a sleeper train addict. I love them. So right now,
100%.
we want the best train network there is so that we can phase out car travel. We can phase out polluting ferries. We can phase out most of everything. Planes. Once we have this, let's not get too crazy. We don't need to keep building massive trains everywhere, sufficiency. But as of now, trains, they really need to be taken care of.
Yeah. Cannabis.
Wow. I don't think I've got an opinion on the matter.
You don't have to. It's okay. It's legal in Canada, by the way. So, and it hasn't caused any more major social disruptions. Just as a footnote for our viewers. Okay, next, electric scooters. I mean it as a tricky question.
Ooh, I know it's a tricky question.
Yeah.
I want to say less of it.
Okay.
If I had to motivate it, I think it's a very inefficient mode of transport. In the sense of, we go back to the concept of Ivan Illich of generalized speed. Just an electric scooter, okay, it's nice in the city if, instead of taking your car, you're just going to sell your SUV and just go an electric scooter. But that's not what's happening. It's, not a mobility transition, it's a mobility addition. So people do it on top, they do it a bit on the side. And most electric scooters, they are just organized by for-profit corporation that use them for a lot of nasty pursuits, like also the gathering of personal data that then you can resell to advertising agencies. So in the grand scheme of things, as of now, when I see an electric scooter, I'm not like, oh my God, the mode of transportation of the future. The mode of transportation of the future is simple. It has two wheels, or three or four, and pedals and a chain, and people on it with a helmet, just loving life. It's called a bike.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the next one, the easy on bicycles. So more of them, right?
Bikes everywhere. I'm actually a huge slopestyle mountain biking fan myself. So I've been just doing a lot of different kinds of mountain biking since I was a kid.
But it's easy for you guys in Europe. In North America, here, Toronto is like 20 kilometers wide. So it's hard to bike to work. Everybody wants to, but it's very difficult, Yeah, next one, small houses on wheels, also called tiny houses.
Yeah, I like them.
Eco villages.
Love them.
Okay.
If we define eco village by a village starting to just care about its relation to the environment and congregate in a democratic manner to make better decisions about the way it uses resources, I think every village should become an eco village. The abnormality is normal villages.
Skyscrapers.
Then you're trying to trick me, going back to the eco-modernist argument. If I say anything, I will be shut down on Twitter by all the eco-modernists. I would tend to say less of them. I think most skyscrapers, first, when you tell me skyscraper, I see, offices. And the kind of offices in skyscrapers are usually not the one of nice little NGOs or not-for-profit cooperatives. They're the, social quarters of huge corporations. So definitely, if we're thinking of a world with less work and smaller companies, maybe that will also be a world of smaller buildings for smaller companies.
How about condominiums, like for living? We have many of these in Toronto. It's like they're growing like mushrooms.
Then
40 stories high, 50,
Then it really depends. I will leave that. I don't have the knowledge about this, but I believe like some architects that really work on sustainable architecture knows. So depending of context, I have nothing against them as long as they're, a socially desirable and ecologically sustainable forms of construction. And, they're constructed following ideals of well-being and beauty before looking at their economic cost. Then whatever is being produced, if it's produced in that way, I want more of that.
Awesome. Perfect. North American suburbs.
I mean, you're asking someone that has been, I've been in Colorado for 3 months for an internship once in my life, and that's pretty much it. So the
But
North
I've seen the
American
movies
suburbs,
and
I've seen the movies, but
yeah,
I
yeah.
tend to try not to make like general statement about other cultures
Mhm.
based on like
Fair enough.
watching their cinema. So I'll pass on that one. But
So fair enough, fair
I can
enough.
tell you about European suburbs and especially French and
Okay,
Swedish suburbs.
please.
And even when you look at this, you start to see a problem that, of course, you must be experiencing in in a in a manifolded way. But I like the concept of the 15-minute city. A city where,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
walking distance, 15 minutes max, you have access to everything. You can go to work, you can go to do everything you need to do, go to the park, go to do sport, go to see your families, go to see your friends. I like this idea. I've always been living in small cities, lived in Amsterdam, lived in
Mm-hmm.
Uppsala, lived in Lund. I really appreciate the fact of just being my bike and just going around and never cycling for more than just 15 and 20 minutes. I find this quite pleasant, and also from studies that we see, it also seems to be one of the way of limiting, the emissions related to carbon. So that's a huge urbanism challenge. But in my
Yeah.
nice little utopia, I imagine there are just no more of these weird suburbs where you live and where you have to
Yeah.
commute to where you work.
Another difficult one, so please pass it if you want. Children.
Oh, a very good friend of mine just wrote a book called like, Should We Stop Making Children to Save the Planet? And this is what I consider to be one of the most advanced pieces of science on the link between climate and demography. And it's actually, the answer is not yes. So
Okay.
so the climate situation, I think demography has very little to do with the question, both as a problem and as a solution. So when you tell me children, like, I don't think climate, I don't think footprint, and I think that's the right way to approaching that thing. When you tell me children, I think children, and as a very mainstream way of behaving, and just love children. I mean, my brother just had two of them, and that has just brought so much joy in my life. And so that's,
Uncle
for me,
Tim.
they're outside. Uncle Tim, that is completely outside of my work on degrowth. That's how much I've pushed it on the side, because for me it's not relevant.
Perfect. Four more easy ones, I hope. Greta Thunberg as a symbol,
A hero. I wish,
Yes.
I want to be like her when I grow up.
Perfect answer. Thank you. Space exploration.
Less of it. Whatever we discover in space, I mean, surely that can be posed. So,
do you want to qualify the answer, or just no,
yeah,
less
just
of
to
it?
say, like,
Okay.
space tourism, and that's an absolute no. Space exploration, I mean, I feel right now, and then I'm going to quote Herman Daly, that was also saying we're not even able to manage our small planet. Why do you want to colonize a new one? Like, honestly, just sort out problems at home, and then we can start at like starting a colony on Mars.
That's right. Yeah.
And space exploration, as exciting as it is, and as rich it can be for scientific discoveries of all kind, and I know it can galvanize and create an identity of exploration and bring people together into this grand international project, and that's a great thing. But right now, space exploration doesn't get a joke card. It's still something that mobilizes resources and carbon and everything. And if you have to make me choose between, growing food or putting some bringing some people outside of energy poverty and just discovering something cool about the moon or Jupiter, I will just put the first one in priority and just wait a bit later so we eradicate poverty, and then we go to the moon and discover what's there. Maybe.
Okay. Second to last one, nuclear power.
Also, that's the trap. And the funny thing, I'm going to tell you, like, my opinion about nuclear power is as much developed as my opinion towards cannabis. That's the kind of topics that I'm actually so uninterested about, that I'm like, I've not even developed an opinion about it. As a degrowther, I work a lot on reducing energy demand in general. That's my thing. Then there's a lot of people that just will be like, oh, well, which part of which energy is the most efficient and the greener, and that's a great debate for them. For me, my goal is to, the most sustainable resource is the one we don't have to use. So I'm trying to find the best way of reducing energy demand. And then the debates about nuclear, they're important, but they also appear secondary to that goal. So
And last one, YouTubers that talk about degrowth.
Ha! More of them.
It's a bit
Them
self-serving.
everywhere. All over YouTube. That's a definite yes.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your time. I really appreciated your thorough answers. This was very illuminating for all of us. I encourage everyone to follow you everywhere they can on your website, read your thesis, your books, your blog. We definitely will be hearing more of you soon at some point.
Thank you so much for having me, Vlad. See you around.